Okay, today we're going to talk about ecology, specifically our levels of organization and matter and energy flow. But first, what is ecology? Ecology is a study of interactions among living things and between living things and their surroundings. A key word here is interactions. And this is between other living things, which remember is biotic, and their surroundings, which is going to be abiotic. So we depend on both living and non-living things to stay alive. A key word with ecology is interdependence. We rely on both living and non-living things to stay alive. Nothing can live on its own without the help of other things. If you recall, our levels of organization, our smallest one is the organism itself, just one individual of a species. Our population is same species. Our community are going to be all of your biotic factors, so all of your living things, all of your populations. Your ecosystem is going to be your community, which is your biotic factors, plus your abiotic factors, all non-living things too. We also have biome next, and biome is going to be all your ecosystems with similar climate and organisms. Climate we're going to define as like temperature and precipitation, and then biosphere, anywhere in the world that can sustain life. So organism, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere. So all ecosystems, we have both our living things and our non-living things. Remember, our living things in this case is going to be your community. So basically your community, and then all of the physical environment, the non-living things surrounding it. Energy can be traced back to sunlight, because remember photosynthesis. And your producers, through the process of photosynthesis, produce sugars, and those sugars are passed on from organism to organism through consumption or even decomposition. So our producers, we can also group them as autotrophs. They make their own food. Majority of them are going to do it through photosynthesis. And then you also have your consumers, or your heterotrophs, and they must eat. They must consume. They cannot make their own energy, so they have to get it from other organisms. Other examples of your heterotrophs are going to be your scavengers. And then we also have your decomposers as well. They cannot make their own energy, so they need to break down dead things to get that last bit of energy. So our types of consumers. First, we have our herbivores, or just our plant eaters. So they eat plants directly. These will also be called primary consumers. Your omnivore, they eat both plants and animals. And these can be anywhere from primary to tertiary consumers, since they have options. And when we talk about food chains and food webs, this will make a little bit more sense in terms of where they fit on the food chain. Carnivores are the opposite of herbivores. They only eat meat. So these primarily are going to be your secondary to tertiary consumers, because primary only eats your producers. And then your detritivores are mainly going to be your decomposers. They eat dead organic matter. This can also be some of your scavengers as well. So they kind of fit their own important role within the food chain. Now, food chains and food webs. Food webs are complex. They're made up of all of the food chains connected. So these are all of the feeding pathways. So the arrow shows the flow of energy. So in terms of what is eating what, this fish, shark eats it. And a turtle eats that. This fish eaten by the shark. So it's always pointing to what eats it. So where is that energy transferred to? Where are those carbohydrates, those lipids, those proteins? Where are kind of our four major biomolecules transferred to? Now in a food chain, the difference is this is a single feeding pathway. A food web shows them all. This is simply just one part of the food web. Everything stems from the sun. Without the sun, life as we know it probably wouldn't exist. Your producer is going to use photosynthesis to make sugar. Your producer may be eaten. What eats it is called the primary consumer. These are going to be your herbivores. And then what eats your primary consumer is called your secondary consumer. This is your carnivore. They eat meat. And then whatever eats your secondary consumer is called your tertiary consumer. And this is still another example of a carnivore. We are simply just moving up the food chain. And then finally, in the end, you have your decomposer. Now you could actually have arrows from all of them pointing to the decomposer. Because anything that dies, the decomposer is going to break down, and then it's going to send all of those leftover nutrients back into the soil, and the grass and your producers will take them up. So, think circle of life, Lion King. Everything is interconnected. Everything depends on one another. And remember, our law of conservation of matter says matter cannot be created or destroyed. It is simply reorganized. So with your food chains and your food webs, the word trophic is just a fancy word for energy. So your producers, your autotrophs, your algae, your phytoplankton, in terms of the ocean, is what creates all of the energy for all of the ocean inhabitants. Your primary consumer is going to eat your producer. These are going to be your plant eaters, shrimp, zooplankton, sea turtles, parrotfish. Your secondary consumer eats the primary. Your carnivores, sponge, jellyfish, and then your tertiary consumer eats your secondary. Still carnivores, because we are eating meat. So in this case, it is our reef shark. And then we have all of this kind of interconnected web mess, because these are showing all of the possible feeding relationships. A turtle eats several things. So we see that it's going to eat algae. And when we look at the reef shark, it's going to eat this parrotfish. It's going to eat the triggerfish. So showing all of the possibilities in terms of what makes up their diet. That's what a food web shows. Food chain, one example. Okay, pyramid models. We can also kind of show our food chain, food web, in what's called an energy pyramid, where we are focusing on the energy being used by everything. Now, an important thing here is we have the 10% rule. Approximately 10% of the energy available at one trophic level will be available to the next. So if we start at 100% at the producers, only 10% of that 100% is going to be available. Which means out of the original 100, when it gets to the secondary consumer, only 1%. When it gets to the tertiary consumer, 0.1%. So some of that energy is being used during the lifetime of the organism. As they use it, it's lost as heat. So as you go up the food chain, there's less and less energy available the higher up you go, which is why we see less and less organisms at the top of the food chain compared to the bottom. There's not a lot of energy to support a greater population of owls compared to kind of the gophers that you see as your primary consumer, or more owls than grass. Not going to happen. Grass can make their own sugar, so they're very efficient. Owls have to go through like 2 different steps to get their energy, and a lot is lost along the way as heat and just simply, whether it's used by the organism, the reserves, and then also it'll be left just through excretion as well. Other pyramids, we have what's called the biomass pyramid. This is simply just identifying how much mass we have at each step of the way. So since there is more energy at the bottom, more energy is going to equal more biomass. So your producers will have the most biomass because there's more of it. Your tertiary consumer, top of the food chain, has your least because there's not a lot of it. There's not a lot of energy to support your tertiary consumer in comparison. So you look at this number here, 2,000 grams per meter squared, 75 grams per meter squared. That's quite the difference. And it all has to do with how much energy is available at each step. You also have the pyramid of numbers. Once again, simply, in this case, more energy equals more organisms. So going back to our percentages, your producers have access to 100% of all the energy because they make it. And then about 10%, and then about 1%, and then about 0.1%. That 10% rule. So you're going to see less mountain lions than snakes or wolves, than rabbits, squirrels, or turkeys compared to your plants. Everything comes back to how much energy is available. The more energy available, the more biomass, the more organisms. Now the final thing we're going to talk about is biomagnification. And this is the accumulation of toxins, pollutants in tissues of organisms as you move up the food chain. For those of you that may have families at some point in your lives, one thing that pregnant women have to watch out for is different fish they need to avoid to eat whenever they're pregnant. Examples of this might be bluefish, swordfish, kind of your top of the food chain fish, because as we see pollutants in the waters, they will start to accumulate up the food chain. So your top predators will have a greater amount of those pollutants because as you go up the food chain, the toxins start to add up. So your top predators are going to be more affected by these pollutants than your producers or your primary consumers, because it kind of adds up as you go up the food chain. And this is something that we even have to watch out for as well when you eat certain things, just to make sure it's safe to eat. And which organisms are at the greatest risk for biological magnification? Your top consumers. So an example of this would be like your top predators, which odds are going to be your tertiary consumers, your third level consumers, because they get more and more concentrated as you move up. So, tuna, swordfish, bluefish, a lot of your bigger game fish, since they're the top predators, will have a greater chance of having higher mercury levels, for instance. You really have to watch out for how much mercury you consume, especially for a pregnant woman. You don't want to potentially damage or hurt the growing baby. All right, that is it for the first part of ecology: levels of organization, matter flow, and energy flow. If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks for watching.